Yeah, it's true.
So,
It's true. But exploring that's the part of fun of being an artist, you're being creative.
yes.
Okay, I would like to ask then, like, we have the art message and we have like, how do you find it, which is a lot of like introspective work, drawing from your personal experiences. Oh, and I would like to add with that, when you are trying to find your message, I don't want to underestimate how having an exchange with someone else helps with that. Again, I want to encourage, like, I love that you've opened, the program for mentorships. And it's what I do a lot with artists when I onboard them as clients. Like, there's something magical when you can just like ping pong ideas and someone else can help see what you can't because maybe you're too close to home. So I do want to
Yes.
say that a lot of discovering your message comes with outside perspective. So try to look for that.
Absolutely. I think that was one of the key things in my last round of masterpiece makers was just people sharing their art and then getting the feedback from a community of people who can say, yeah, I see, bright, bold expression. And what I love about it is that everyone is so unique and
Yeah.
different. And everyone has just a different expression, right? It's
Mm-hmm.
just it's so cool. But it does help so much to have someone else take a look at your art and give you feedback on what they see
Yeah.
in your art making. And I think you did that one time with all of your Instagram people. You had them submit their art and
Yeah.
then you gave them feedback on what you saw as the message behind their art. I think people were really amazed that you were able to pick up on those nonverbal cues type of thing,
Mhm.
right?
It's true. And I actually love doing that, of looking, because I think there's something said even in the technique. So I remember looking at an artist where she had like that, you could tell that there were thousands of mini like brush strokes. It was like da, 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 da. And I'm like, if she's finding pleasure in taking the time to do that many like brush strokes, there's something about her that loves being detail oriented. You know what I'm saying? And I'm like, oh,
Mm-hmm.
there's a message of people who find the beauty in the details. I work with an artist who, she had a show in Atlanta, and the curator from that show expressed, she's like, wow, she has a genius of using the minimal amount of brush strokes but really capturing the essence. And it's true. When she said that, I was like, oh my gosh, that makes so much sense with how I know the artist's personality. So I do think that in the end, even if it's subconscious, the way that we're choosing to express the art technique says a lot about who we are as people. Again, the color choices, the composition, the topic, and having someone that can have insight into that is really helpful. So, what I'm trying to say is invest in mentorships and good art colleagues and friends, a community, and have
Right.
people like be open and flexible. Don't take it personal if you don't like feedback as well. But be open for people to, like, I don't know, help you mold a perspective, mold your message, because maybe a lot of it is you're blind to it. It's a blind spot to you, but other people see your strengths.
Right. And I'm just thinking along the lines of like what do artists do when there's almost that disconnect, right? Between their expression and what they actually want to be
Yeah.
doing. Like because that happens sometimes. And that was one of the biggest aha moments for me in my art practice was when I really just sat down and said, like, this is the art that I love that really captivates me and makes me excited. And it was so different, Sarah. It was like really messy and abstract and free flowing. And here
Yeah.
I was making these cute little forest animals.
Yeah.
And honestly, I don't think that there was anything deep about that type of art making, because actually I was making art for other people. And I
Okay.
think that
Yeah.
is a huge, huge piece, right? When
Mhm.
we are making what other people are expecting us to make, then our art is very and constrictive,
Yeah.
right? It doesn't feel expansive. It doesn't feel exciting inside of us, right? Because we
Yeah.
feel like this is what I should be doing, right?
Yeah.
Instead of something that comes from this deeper part inside of us. Don't
Yeah.
you think? And so
Agree.
I think that's also a clue is, when I really looked at what do I want to be making or what do I feel most drawn to, and realized that that wasn't what I was doing, that was a huge wake up call for me. I was like, why am I even doing this?
Hmm.
Right. And I'm sure I know, because I have conversations with artists all the time, and especially when it comes to realistic form. And I'm guessing that you have felt that pressure too, because your art is not realistic form, right?
Mm-mm.
And I think in our culture, a lot of, especially people who don't understand art, they hold that as like the highest form of art making is this realistic form that's
Yes.
aesthetically pleasing, and both you and I both don't do that. So I don't know, what do you have any thoughts on that?
I mean, you're spot on. When statistically in sales, we know that art that portrays more realistically sells better. And that's actually going to lead me to say this, like when we understand how people buy art, and I'm not saying this as a right or a wrong, I'm just saying more factually. We are not, like, I don't think anywhere in the world you're not taught to interact with art. You might have a class on how to make art, like art education, but no one is taught how to interact and consume art. So we kind of, everyone, most people just navigate the art industry, movies, series, music, books, literature, and then visual arts, just as more entertainment, preference, if I like it, if I don't. And people buy art based on how familiar they are with what they see. So if you artists who create realistic art facilitates people to buy it because they know what they're looking at. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
So statistically, it is what sells more as a category. But then that's why, like, if you don't make art that's realistic, that's more abstract or figurative or just different categories, it's important. This is where I personally think is important to have the message, because you don't want to influence a person's interpretation of art, but you want to assist the context of them understanding art so that they can buy it, because people buy what they understand. So again, a message is very important, whether you can assist just aesthetically, because I know a lot of artists, like if it has a beautiful color palette that can match someone's space, or maybe like I would say the message is best assisted if it is verbal, like captions or interactive on social media. Then it does help with the sales, because my point is realistic art sells better because people understand what they're buying visually. But then if that's not your form of creating art, then give them context with the message. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And I just wanted to share an example of this and just share that, I love what you share with artists, in that when you are sharing a piece of your artwork, you should always say, this artwork is for, and
Mhm.
then define who it's for,
Yes.
because you never know who, or yeah, like who is actually watching and who's going to connect with it.
Yes.
Right. And so I want to just share a story, because I just recently launched a collection over the summer. It was like one of the techniques that I like to create is I will take materials and collage elements underneath my paintings, like this one right here.
Mm-hmm.
I will start with collage and then I will turn it into like a floral bouquet, but then I layer, the cold wax medium and oil paint. But I was actually I love using textiles in my art. And I
Yeah.
think a lot of that comes from my mom, who was an amazing seamstress and she was always sewing things. So I've always been exposed to lots of fabrics in my life, and it's part of my creative journey and part of remembering my mom and what an amazing artist she was, not only a seamstress but also a watercolor artist. So I was actually sharing on my Instagram how I was honoring my mom through this collection, and I talked about her, and I just shared like a 2 or 3 minute video talking about my collection, talking about my mom. And literally, one of the gals who had never bought from me before, so she was a new customer, she saw that and she bought 2 of my biggest pieces for her mom, who is a seamstress. So that just shows you that sharing about your story, about your process, about really why is this artwork significant to you. She was able to make that connection with her own mom, right? And so I think it's so powerful when artists can learn how to tap into this
Yeah.
and communicate it to their audience and their customer.
Yes, I love you shared with me when that happened, and I love that story. I think that's how powerful art is when when you are proposing art as a message, like through the message, especially when it's authentic to you and it's real, it's part of your personal journey. Because I think that's, when artists ask me, like, how do I find buyers and collectors? And I say that trick is you don't find them, you define them. Because here's the thing that I think when selling art, a lot of, again, because most people aren't educated to consume art, and the whole point of art is usually just for people to relate to what they're seeing. Again, it's understanding. But the thing is, a lot of people don't know who they are. Their life mission is to discover themselves, and they rely on their surroundings and usually external sources to help them see that. So that's why nowadays a lot like therapy and psychology is really high in demand. And I think that artists, not saying that we are psychologists or therapists, but when we know what we're communicating with art and portraying it as a message, it helps people see themselves in it. And then which leads me to like our third part is like, how do you communicate it? Is exactly that. You share it like you did, where, oh, it's part of my mom's story. This was what inspired me. And then someone who saw that immediately made the connection and purchased it because people want to be surrounded by what's valuable to them. So in her case, like her mom's job as a seamstress, or,
Yeah.
then it makes sense. Art makes sense to people to buy it, to consume it, for artists to make it. It all starts like tying like perfectly together.
Right. And I think, something that you were saying, like about really just knowing who we are as a person and as an artist. Like, I think something that I notice with a lot of artists that come up is honestly this fear of actually being seen, right?
Ooh,
And
yeah.
I think that that is one of the biggest hurdles that artists have to overcome when it comes to sharing. Some artists have a hard time sharing the message behind their art, but some artists even have a hard time sharing their art in general. Like, oh my goodness, this is my heart and my soul, and it's just out there to be exposed for everyone to look at. And so I just want to recognize that, because I think that is one of the biggest challenges for artists, is to really being willing to be vulnerable in a way that feels very scary and like you're exposed. And I think that, honestly, I'm not entirely sure how to move past that except for going through it. Right. And I personally feel like when I am willing to be vulnerable, to share that message behind my art making, there really is nothing better than that feeling when, like you were saying, someone else can look at my art and say, me too, I feel that way too. And so I think that that is a huge piece in being able to communicate the message behind your art. But even just sometimes it even keeps people from honestly even exploring the type of art that they want to be making in the first place, right? So do you have any thoughts on that? Like, how do you move past that scare?
That I will say this because I've shared with you some of my like professional fears, not necessarily art related, and you always say exactly that, just do it, you'll get used to it. And I did come across, now I don't remember. Oh yes, it's a book I read twice already, but last year was the last time that I reread it. It's called The Mountain Is You by Brianna West, and she taught, like, the whole book is about self-sabotaging, but she does point a lot of things from a neuroscience perspective, and she says that it is human instinct to preserve ourselves in the familiar, because if you can plan a predictable outcome, survival instinct. Great, I'll stay here. The thing is, growth does come through, like, moving in the discomfort. You have to step out of it. And all these
Mhm.
good things can happen, some not good things as well. But to push yourself, she explains that the brain, literally your brain, functions on evidence. So if you do one thing,
Mm.
and your brain understands, like, it feels threatened, but then it can actually see, like, okay, I didn't die, let's do it again. And then you do it again and you're like, okay, people responded positively, someone even connected with my artwork, okay. And then you do it again until the repetition makes your brain adapt it as a habit, because now it became your comfort zone, where predictability is a factor into what you do on a daily basis. So,
Yeah.
like, I push myself, like, any times that I feel the anxiety of fear or something that's outside of my comfort zone, it do motivate me to, exactly like you said, there's no way around it. You just have to go through it. But then I tell myself, my brain is begging me for evidence that it's going to be okay once I do what I have to do. And then
I
just
love that, Sarah, because I feel like I'm constantly pushing through my own fear boundaries of what feels safe. And for me,
Mhm.
it's, early on in my business, it was sharing my art and talking about my art, but I
Yeah.
don't even bat an eyelash at that anymore. I'm like, psh, who
Yeah.
cares? I don't care anymore. Like, I have this knowing inside of me that I absolutely love the artwork that I'm making. Sure, there's like occasionally there's like someone that you get, like, I
Yeah.
remember one time um, posting an abstract painting. Like, this was maybe a year or two ago, and the person was like, "You should stick to florals." Like, you get like these really like
Yeah.
random people who you know are just like to rain on people's parades or whatever. But for the most part, I don't really think of I don't feel scared or fearful about sharing my art anymore, because it's just like you said, I have the evidence to show. And I think, enough people have given me that positive feedback as tied to my art making, that I'm not so easily swayed by what
Yeah.
people think about me or my art, right? And I think sometimes, you also have to have this outlook of like, maybe my art isn't for everyone, right? And I think that is also key. But like you said, like I have other things in my business where I do have that fear of like, I'm doing something new and it
Yeah.
feels uncertain and I don't know how it's going to turn out. So we
Yeah.
all feel that about something. And so it does get easier.
Yes.
So,
That leads me for us to wrap up. There are two questions that I did want to ask because I opened the question box to like on my Instagram account to get questions about art message, and I shared them with you, and you said, "Wow, this is very similar to what my students also have." So I'm like, okay, apparently these are questions that circle back a lot. But one of them is, does the meaning have to be deep and philosophical? Like, what do you think about that? Like, does it have to be profound and impacting?
right. And so I honestly, I was kind of laughing at that because when I went through my last round of mentorship, Masterpiece Makers, and I had several students who just for weeks on end were like, I cannot figure out the message behind my art making. I think, you know, I think part of that was maybe because they were comparing themselves to someone else. And because they were listening to me, where I have this really deep meaning, and the way that I came about making art felt like like it was a more valid reason to make art. And so I think sometimes artists are like comparing themselves, and so they just automatically are like, well, I don't have some
Yeah.
amazing story. And I actually had two or three students who told me that. And I think, again, you have to just really go back to why are you making art? And, I don't personally think that it has to be something so incredibly deep, but it's tied to that emotion that you're wanting to express. Does that make
Perfect.
sense?
It makes perfect sense. I agree with that. It doesn't have to be deep, it's just tied to the emotion of the art. So maybe
Yeah,
it's for like, there are a lot of people that just want to have like a fun home and they're just like full of life and party energy. And then you see artwork that really represents that. The artist is like, yeah, let's go all colorful and crazy. There are other people that just want peace and serenity and not even something deep. They just like, no, I just want like a chill atmosphere at home. This artwork fits perfectly. And then others do like have more of a profound like emotional connection. Well, all of them have some emotional tie to it, but just like the thought provoking, storytelling of something eventful. I like to think that like there's as much art can be as varied and diversified as there are people in the world. So if there's like
it's
8
true.
billion people, then there are 8 billion ways to make art.
Yeah,
We
I
all
like that. I think it's true. And I think that once an artist really is able to be honest with themselves about what that emotion is, then all the pieces will start to
yeah.
fall into place. I'm thinking specifically of one of my students who was like, yeah, I feel peaceful in nature and I want to communicate that through my art making, that type of thing. And so I agree. I don't think it has to be something like really deep and moving, but don't compare yourself either.
Yeah, this is the takeaway. Don't compare yourself. Just be true. Like, so it
Yeah.
doesn't have to be deep and meaningful. Well, meaningful, yes, but it doesn't have to be deep. It can be like shallow fun as long as it's not coming from a place of comparison. And you mentioned, leading to the last question, but you mentioned you got a comment of someone saying, stick with florals. And the question is, can you change your message? Like, what if you want to change your art and change your message? What do you think about that?
Yeah, I do think you can change your message. And I think that we have different, it's almost like, I don't know. I don't know what the word I'm looking for is. We as artists can constantly almost reinvent ourselves,
Yeah.
right? And that sort of brings up So early on in my career, I heard a quote by Sabrina Ward Harrison, and she said that we create that which we need the most in our lives, or something along those lines. Like,
I love
we make the art that we really need. So I think sometimes, and that question, I think also can help you find the message behind your art, right? And so there have been times where I feel drawn to, you know, using lots of like white space in my paintings. Like, I want to leave all sorts of negative space. And I think that's like sometimes when I'm feeling that I need more space in my life, right? That might come out more.
Mhm.
Or I want to do a really bright, bold, really in your face painting. Or sometimes I'll go with dark and moody, for a season. And so I do think that it can change and shift and evolve. Although I do think that oftentimes there is kind of a common theme that is woven throughout your career as an artist.
Mhm.
But it's not unheard of. And I think that also you can switch for each collection of art making that
Yeah.
you do. Like, you can say the theme of this collection is this, and then another collection will be something completely different. And you can approach things from different angles, right?
Yeah.
And yeah, I guess that's the main point is, yeah, I think your message can change for different series or collections of work. So,
Yeah.
did you have
Perfect.
anything to add on that?
No, I think that was spot on. When you have a message, I think it can naturally develop into a different message or even a different facet. And then that can be throughout your career, or that can be throughout a collection, or even from one art piece to the other. I will say that from a sales perspective, when you emphasize selling your art through a message, it gives you more freedom to change the aesthetic of your art, because that's often a common difficulty that artists have when sometimes they get tired of doing the same technique or the same aesthetic of art and they want to change it. And the clients that I've worked with, it was easier to have that change of style if your message, if you knew that your buyers and collectors looked at you in reference for your message, because then however your art portrayed it, people were like, oh, I want to buy that because I love the message. But I also think that it is true for when you want to change your message. I think the relationship that you build with your audience is that they respect your intellectual property, they appreciate your intelligence. I think always, I mean, we keep on circling back to this, but always being true to yourself and expressing yourself authentically, you'll always have people that connect with you.
Right. And I do think sometimes when, like, especially early on, like if you're like jumping all over the place
Yeah.
in terms of your styles and your expression and your messages, that it is more difficult for your audience to make a connection with your artwork. So I'm not necessarily against changing, but if you're constantly changing, then you're not going to have that conversation back and forth with your audience. And it especially if they're two really opposing ideas, it might not help your sales, right?
Yeah,
So,
that is true. Oh,
yeah,
perfect. Wendy, this was lovely as always. This was a good conversation. The art
I
was
think so. Yeah.
wonderful.
Well, any finishing thoughts that you have, or any other questions that we didn't get to?
We pretty much went through like every category, and even questions from our audiences. I would love to even, if anyone listening or watching this, like put your questions in the comment section, or even reach out to our Instagram accounts and continue the conversations.
Right, right. And if you want to share some of your artwork with either one of us,
We would love to.
and we would be more than happy to give you some feedback on your art and maybe what we see as being sort of a theme or
That's
you know, I think it's really fun. I just have to share a story from my masterpiece makers. I had a student who was in this last group, and I was looking at one of the exercises that I have my artists do is to create a Pinterest board surrounding like what they feel is like their style or what they want to pursue in their style. And this one lady, she was so sweet. She had a really fun style board, but one of the themes that kept coming up for her was she had all these houses in her paintings of houses with lots of texture, and you know, it was a really lovely Pinterest board. But after getting to know her and her story, she recently lost her, I think he was an adult, but her son. And so one of the themes that she was drawn to was this theme of a home and making sense of, you know, losing that part of her. And I thought that was just like a really cool thing. And I could see from her Pinterest board sort of what that message was really, how do I go on making a home without my son? And so I think sometimes having that outside perspective, like we were talking about, might actually help you as an artist to identify what that message or theme that you want to explore in your art making. So feel free to you know, leave comments, ask us your questions, direct message us on Instagram. Where can people find you, Sarah?
My Instagram handle is at thetime.art.
Thetime.art. And I am Wendy Brightbill on Instagram and Wendy Brightbill Studio here on YouTube. I think Sarah was telling me. I'm like, I don't even know. But anyways, yeah, give us your feedback and let us know if you have any questions surrounding the message behind your art. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.